Hi there, students. I've noticed that students tend to avoid using modal verbs, particularly ought. I did a little check in my comments section, and over the past 12 months there have only been 2 comments that have included the word ought. So this is something that you ought to use more. Okay, when do we use ought? Well, you can use ought as a recommendation. So, for example, when you're visiting London, you ought to visit the Tower of London. It's a recommendation. But in this video, I want to focus on the way we use ought for things that we don't habitually do, but we would be better if we were doing them, or things that we haven't done that it would be better if we had already done them. Now, notice grammatically in the positive, we only have 4 forms with ought, or 4 structures. I ought to do this. I ought to be doing this. I ought to have done this. And I ought to have been doing this. Okay? So, a present continuous, and a present perfect, and a present perfect continuous. So we use ought to talk about bad habits, about being lazy. So let's look at an example. I ought to do my homework. Okay, this can have 2 meanings. I generally don't do my homework, and I ought to do it. Okay, so this is something, it would be better if I did it, but I don't do it. Or I ought to do my homework because I haven't done it yet. Okay? I ought to be doing my homework right now, but I'm not doing my homework, I'm talking to you. So I'm criticizing myself for not doing what I ought or should be doing, ought to be doing. In the past, I ought to have done my homework. So here again we have 2 possibilities. I ought to have done it already, and I'm going to do it now because I haven't done it, but I still have time. Or when the teacher asked for the homework, I realised that I ought to have done it, but I hadn't done it. Okay, so 2 different ones there. And then I ought to have been doing my homework. It's something that I ought to have been doing at a certain time in the past. So an example with the last one, I was chatting with my friends on the phone when the boss came in yesterday, and he said that I ought to have been doing my work instead of chatting with my friends. So we really very commonly use this ought, saying that it's a failure to do something. Yeah? You ought not to do that, but you do it. And this is the idea. He's been so rude, I ought to tell him to leave, but I'm not going to. Okay, so we're using this ought to talk about things that it would be better or it would be reasonable if we did them, but we're not going to do them. You ought to drive more slowly, but you always zoom around the place. You ought to obey the rules of the road, but you don't. When the traffic light is orange, you ought to stop, not press the accelerator and beat the light. Okay, so ought, talking about things that we don't do or haven't done, and really it would be better if we did them because we don't do them, or it would be better if we started them now. So this ought to, it's talking about a failure to do something that needs to be done or is recommendable. So there you go, that's ought. Please try and include more modal verbs in your English. It's something students really don't do, and it's something that you ought to be doing, but you're not doing it. It's something you ought to do, but you don't do it. Okay? So there you go, ought. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Ought.